Hi, everyone, and welcome back to Adult Bible Studies. I'm Wayne Williams, and as always, it's my pleasure to be with you for this time of Bible study. Today, we're going to continue on in our unit on Job. It's a 5 lesson unit, and this lesson is the third lesson, so we're right in the middle of that unit. And we've taken, the lesson writer has taken this book of Job and broken it down into segments or stages, he calls, that Job that are used to show us the different phases that Job goes through as he deals with this idea of suffering. Now, suffering is powerful, isn't it? Suffering is one of those things that often challenges our faith, challenges our hope, makes us ask why. And sometimes, frankly, it's very hard to resolve. Uh, Job is a book that helps us a little bit see how a person of sincere and deep faith and relationship with God moves through these types of things oftentimes. Nothing says it has to be this way or that these 5 stages that the lesson writer has broken this narrative down into are the only 5 stages or 5 different types of emotions or mindsets that someone might go through. But it's just an example of how we can see in ourselves and in others that they are responding to suffering, perhaps in some very human ways, and some ways that are not denying God, are not uh, being against God, but simply asking God, Father, help me. I don't understand. You know, understanding God is so far beyond me uh, that I know I won't ever reach that level of relationship with Him in this life. And yet, there are many things that I wrestle with and try to gain what limited understanding I can gain. And that's what we see here with Job. In the first lesson, we looked at Job, and we started off with God bragging on Job. Look at my servant Job. He's a good man. He's wealthy and he's prosperous and he's kind and he has a good family and he's very his relationship with me is solid and his sincerity in his relationship is real. And then all these calamities come upon Job. And Job is stripped of those things that many in our world, perhaps many of us, would just be crushed by because they are measures that we use so much in this life and in this world of God's blessing, of our abilities, our affirming ourselves and who we are as people. And when we lose those things, it leaves a big hole. Well, Job went from being praised by God to losing everything, losing all of his material wealth, all of his flocks and all of his servants. His sons and daughters were together in a house when a great storm came through and it collapsed on them, and all of them were killed. And there's Job, hearing all this news, one thing, boom, 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 after another. And there was no good news. And what was Job's initial response? What was that first stage that he went through? He worshiped. He rent his clothes, he shaved his head, he prepared himself to humble himself before God and worship. The next week, we looked at chapter 2, and we picked up there where Job was worshiping, and we saw that in his worship, he made a very significant statement of faith in God. He says, naked I came into the world, and naked I shall leave the world. All that I've done in between has been the result of God's grace and God's mercy, and nothing that I have done personally outside of that is anything that will last. It's God that matters. God gives, God can take away. Praise be to God. Wow. He resigned himself to the reality that God is God, and God alone understands and makes some of these choices of the things that happen in our world and that rattle our cage so strongly. Well, this week, the stage that we are seeing Job enter into is a stage that's titled Protest. Job's cup is getting quite full. His cup of suffering is getting, he's just reaching that point of intolerableness for us as human beings. You know, we have limits. We can break, and we can have emotional breaks. We can have cognitive breaks. We can have spiritual breaks. And if we don't protest, if we don't raise our voice and say, hey, something's going on here, this is not right, then we do break. And yet, Job uses that very means to move through this stage of being overwhelmed. During this stage, he has three friends who come to visit him. One man is named Eliphaz, another Bildad, another Zophar. Undoubtedly, these men are men who are of equal status to Job when he was a great man and when he had a great kingdom and household and affluence in the world around him, because they come to him as peers and they come to him as counselors. They come to him as support. I want to say something very good about these men. They were very wise men. You know, sometimes when we see someone suffering, we rush in with all kinds of cliches and nice sounding phrases and easy fixes and all these things. And it's just not much good, is it? Sometimes there just aren't words to help a person face what they're facing. Sometimes the best we can do is just be present with them. I was a chaplain in the Air Force, and my ministry as a chaplain was referred to as a ministry of presence. I was to be there to represent God. I was to be there to remind those men and women, their commanders, and the highest guy on the totem pole and the lowest guy on the totem pole, that God cared about them and God was there with them going through what they were going through. And that was my job. I loved that job. And I loved being able to be right there. Thank goodness our nation has seen the need to include that as a part of our military. And that was a job that I loved because of that sense of presence, of being able to be there. Bildad, Eliphaz, and Zophar had that ministry of presence to Job. And they were doing pretty good at it. For 7 days, they didn't say a thing. That's almost mind-boggling, isn't it? To sit with someone who is suffering so greatly. We were told last week that Job had sores from the soles of his feet to the tip of his head, and they hurt and they itched, and he was just in agony. And they sat there and just offered him their presence, their support, by being there with him. They weren't doctors. They weren't able to heal him, but they could be there with him. That's why we sit with people in the hospital, isn't it? That's why we go to each other when things are going wrong, and why sometimes we bring a meal to a family that's going through a hard time. That ministry of presence. And they did good, like I said, for 7 days, and then they blew it. Their human nature surfaced. They had been sitting there commiserating, I'm sure, for this 7 days about all the possibilities of why all these things had happened to Job. And we know that the prominent theology of their day was very works oriented. And by works orientation, I mean their understanding was that if you do good and you follow God's laws, God will bless you. If you do evil, and you break God's laws, God will discipline you. Cut and dry. True. Black and white. No gray. If you do the right things, you'll be blessed. If you do the wrong things, you'll be disciplined, cursed, or have other consequences come upon you. And so they sat there and they saw these grave consequences that Job had been subjected to. And in their heart of hearts, they said, whoa, what could my friend Job have done? It doesn't appear that even though they took 7 days to get to the point where they raised their accusations to Job that he must have done something wrong, that even once they just said, now wait a minute, I know Job. He's a good man. He's not the kind of person that would do anything that would bring this kind of thing upon him. Instead, what they do is they put on their human wisdom, their worldly wisdoms, they pick up some of those cliches and other things that we use sometimes, and they came to Job. And listen to what Eliphaz says. He's the first one that speaks. He starts off just like you're supposed to start off when you're teaching somebody. He starts off with praise. He says, Job, think how you have instructed many. Job, you've been a teacher. You've been someone who taught other people. Excuse me. Think how you have instructed many, how you have strengthened feeble hands. Your words have supported those who stumbled. You have strengthened faltering knees. That's in chapter 4, the first few verses there. And he's doing pretty good, isn't he? He's sounding pretty much like a friend to Job. And then comes that little word that we all hate so much. But now trouble comes to you and you are discouraged. Job, look, it was so easy for you when you were rich and famous and you had all this power, empowerment and stuff to go and respond to other people. But now that something's happened to you, you're just discouraged. You're just willing to give in to it. It strikes you and you are dismayed. Should not your piety be your confidence and your blameless ways your hope? That's not a bad counsel because it goes right along with their theology of that day. Shouldn't the fact that you are pious and that you have been blameless in your ways be something that gives you hope? But there's that little hidden probe in there with those words, isn't it? Clearly, Job, something's going wrong here, and you're not as pious and as blameless as you make yourself out to be. He goes on and he says, consider now, who being innocent has ever perished? He says, Job, have you ever known someone to perish who was innocent of a crime? He says, when were the upright ever destroyed? Come on, Job, give me an example. Can you tell me if any time something like this has happened to anyone else and they were destroyed? As I have observed, those who plow evil and those who sow trouble reap it. Oh, words. James talks to us about how terrible the tongue can be, and our words can hurt so badly. As children, we're taught words can never hurt me, but that's just not so, is it? Words can cut us to the very quick of our hearts. Words can just tear us asunder. Eliphaz, in his wisdom and his learnedness, does a very good dialogue with Job, but it's wrong. It sounds wonderful. It goes right along with the theology of the day, but it's wrong because Job knows in his heart that he does not deserve this. And Eliphaz, as the friend that he poses to be, is not willing to give Job the benefit of the doubt. Well, Bildad goes on and does the same thing. Zophar goes on and does the same sort of thing. And each time Job says, I am innocent. Hear what he says here. We've got some excerpts in our material here from chapter 19. Let's look at those. It says, Then Job responded, How long will you harass me and crush me with words? Your words are hurting me, friends. Don't you understand? These 10 times you've humiliated me. Shamelessly you insult me. Friends, you are hurting me. Stop. Have I really gone astray? If so, my error remains hidden inside of me. Job says, I have tried to explore that possibility and I just can't see what it is. And thus far, God has not confronted me to make it clear to me what I have done. He says, So, if you look down on me and use my disgrace to criticize me, know then that God has wronged me and enclosed his net over me. In other words, if you continue with your line of thought, you have to understand that God has done this. God has done evil. God has brought this upon me directly and intentionally. He's trying to hurt me. And he goes on and he says, if you believe that God is trying to push me away, then you can see all these other things that are happening as effects, parts of that. But they're not relationships between me and God. They're relationships between me and my fellow man. Other people are only too quick to judge. He says there, he has distanced my family from me. I've lost my family. My acquaintances are also alienated from me. My friends, the people I know, my business associates, the people at church, the people who I just say hello to, how are you doing? My visitors have ceased. He was a wealthy man, and people used to come just to ask to be granted an audience to sit and talk to him. He says, my visitors have ceased. Those who know me have forgotten me. My guests and female servants think me a stranger. I'm a foreigner in their sight. They have totally disowned me. And people will do that, won't they? We can really disown one another, and it hurts. I call my servant, and he doesn't answer. My right hand man, he's saying, the one whom I depended on, the one who was able to speak in my behalf. I call on him now and he doesn't even answer me, not even when I beg him. My breath stinks to my wife. I'm odious to my children. Even the young despise me. I get up and they rail against me. All my closest friends despise me. The ones I have loved turn against me. Like you, Eliphaz, Bildad, Zophar, the people in my life have let me down, but God has not. I want to close with a verse from that 19th chapter, right at the end of our section of verses for today. He's talking about God, and he's making his affirmation of God and God's righteousness. I myself will see him with my own eyes. I and not another. How my heart yearns within me. There is one relationship that I still have and I yearn for and I seek to be utmost and absolute in my life, and that's my relationship with God. In verse 25, he says, I know that my Redeemer lives, and that in the end he will stand upon the earth. Protest? Yes. God doesn't mind us protesting. Matter of fact, God wants us to let him know that we're aware that things aren't going right and that we're willing to consider how things might be turned around and changed. That protest says that we're on the team too, that we're paying attention. But God is the source. God is our Redeemer. And he hears our protests, but he responds to our protests in love and in grace. That's the one thing that's missing in this Old Testament theology, isn't it? Grace. It's not just doing good to be treated good, doing bad and getting bad consequences. There's another element there, and Job is learning that about that element, and he's receiving that element into his life, and that element is grace. God gives, God takes away. It's God's choice. By God's grace are we sustained. By his mercy are we forgiven. It's not about me. And Job turns to his friends and he says, it's not about you. Hear, my friends, the lesson that I have because of my experience to teach you. Job's a powerful book. And I look forward to 2 more weeks of our studying this together. Suffering is such a hard subject for us. And yet, God wants us to understand that things work together for the good of those who are his children. And even though at the moment they may not seem like, feel like, or even have the hope of being like they should be, God is still with us and God is still able. God bless you. Have a great week.